Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for advertising my book. You know, somebody said that you know, academics are people who write one book and then they talk for 10 years about it. And you know, you write it for 10 years and then you talk for 10 years about it, and then you retire, I suppose. Well, I'm kind of tired of talking about my book, so I'll just draw on examples from it, which also tires me, but hopefully not you. I'll draw on examples to make some more general points. And if you have seen some of the quotes before, some of you, I apologize. So, you know, today, you know, yesterday we heard, you know, a very nice and interesting talk by Professor Eckert on Poland and Hungary mostly, and we are all following the news with some concern, and we are all talking about populism, and we're talking about right-wing populism, nationalism, we're talking about white nationalism in the United States, which I think is a misnomer. And, you know, I'm not going to talk about those contextual factors, but rather I'm going to focus on what I think are some of the deeper and often unexplored and, from a liberal point of view, I suppose, broadly speaking, rather unpleasant features of nationalism, though I'm value neutral in this regard. So I'm going to focus on 4 areas and give you some examples. National myths, narratives, and collective memories, status, honor, and nationalism, the instrumental use of nationalism, and the power of ressentiment. So it's really more sort of a cultural sociology, I suppose, of nationalism than anything else. Now, you know, nationalist theories of nationalism often look at nations as social constructions, and justly so, and they discount in that, in some ways, the power of nationalist ideology or nationalist myth. So Gellner famously argues nationalist ideologists are unimportant because they're replaceable. Nationalism is a function of modern industrial society. Hobsbawm says, you know, we invent traditions, you know, it's a noble or not so noble lie from the 19th century, whereby the past is reconstructed by modern political and especially cultural elites and fit to serve the needs of the present, invented tradition. And of course, we have the famous phrase of Anderson, imagined communities. Now, you know, what I wrote about in some of my theoretical and survey articles on nationalism, the fact that something is socially constructed doesn't mean it's not experienced as real. We know that from sociology, where the, you know, one of the most famous adages in sociology is the way, if men define situations as real, they're real in their consequences. It was the Chicago School, right? And of course, Durkheim is the classical sociologist who tells us that collective representations, once solidified, have a life of their own and have a hold on the imagination and you know, influence subjective behavior. So society, you know, is socially constructed, but it also confronts us as an external force and as an objective reality. And that, I think, is true of national myths and national ideology. Now, where do these nationalist collective representations, to quote Durkheim, come from? Well, they come from myths and narratives about the past, essentially. And, you know, yesterday we heard Professor Eckert say the past doesn't go away in democracies. And, well, nationalism, you know, is about the past and construction of the past. Now, you know, I'm fully on board with the modernist school on nationalism, except for one thing, and that is that, you know, those who invented traditions had to build on something that was already there. And something that was already there were usually pre-modern myths or events or historical episodes and so on that were then used and reconstructed in the 19th century or later in the 20th century by intellectuals, mostly in all cases, who were the cultural carriers of nationalism, or at least the creators of national cultures. Sometimes it was only 1 or 2 people in the beginning, and so I like Armstrong's concepts of moving or mobilizing ethnic myths, which he calls ethnic mythomateurs. I like it because it spoke to me about the Serbian case, where, you know, epic poem recital, you know, was a prevalent mode of communicating tradition until the age of literacy, and then was transformed into a national myth by, of course, 19th century intellectuals. So these myths basically create group boundaries. They tell a story in a narrative, and they help define, as he says, group identity in relation to a polity, to an idea of a polity. And I'm not going to read all the quotes because then I won't run out of time, so I put them out there for you to see. But basically, myths have an intense effect on those who listen to them, and they arouse emotions, and they provide for solidarity in the face of external forces. There are many examples of that. Poland is a Christ-like nation. Croatia is the defender of Christianity against Islam. The Kosovo myth in Serbia I'll talk about. Jan Hus in the Czech case, and so on and so on. Sporluk, who broadly sides with the modernists, says also that nationalist ideology matters in the following sense. The stories that people tell about themselves vary. Some nations define themselves as warrior-like, and others as, we can think of the Czechs as, authority subverting shveiks, or kritiks, the famous cartoon, and so on. Some are peaceful, and some are heroic, some are, and whatever. But it matters how they define themselves, and I'm going to give you an example from my former homeland. The Kosovo myth. And in the 1990s, when all those horrible things were happening and Serbs were doing their ethnic cleansing, the Kosovo myth was used very much by some observers to say, see, it's all in their national myth. What is this national myth? They want to create a heavenly Serbia. It's based on this idea that, they lost this battle, they carried this grievance, they look back to the 14th century, and it's even about genocide. They want to kill all the Muslims in revenge, and so on and so on. But often without providing any real evidence or showing the mechanisms of the transmission of this genocidal ideology that is supposedly encoded in a national myth about a fantasy of salvation and a fantasy of revenge. I think there's a more adequate interpretation, but if you say something that's more adequate, you have to kind of show that it's more adequate. So in my view, the myth is about heroic resistance against overwhelming odds. So you go into battle in order to, against a superior enemy in full knowledge of the fact that you will be defeated. And a side motif is the idea of betrayal, because allegedly they lost the battle because of betrayal. And that's a subsequent interpretation of one person. I'll tell you why this matters in some way. So myths will, in my view, have resonance if they are reconfirmed by recurring historical experiences. And in the Serbian case, these were wars against the Ottomans and the Austrians, and later anti-Nazi resistance in World War II. That all reinforces the myth. So one of the main, the best Serbian historian, but also Yugoslav and Serbian state builder, who lived a very long life and was summarized what he thought about the Serbian national experience. And although his study is called A Contribution to the Study of National Character, by national character he meant really stories that people tell about themselves, what matters to them. And the essential drive of this quote is to say, well, listen, the Serbs, think of the state as a sacred entity because it was acquired through heroic struggle throughout the 19th and 20th century at great human cost. And for them, the national idea is connected to the state idea, and he's fully aware that there are other nationalist ideologies, and he mentions them here. For some nations, it's a dynastic tradition, and for other nations, it's a political ideology, and there may be a way of life, like, the American dream, which is dissipating in front of our eyes, and so on and so on. But not for Serbs. For Serbs, it was the state. And, can that be shown to have influenced people in real lifetime or real historical circumstances? Well, yes, it can, actually, and it can be shown, I'll just give a few illustrations, but there are many more of them. So in World War II, the communists, of course, wanted to engage in class struggle and have a communist revolution, and of course their primary motivation was communist ideology. But when they went to mobilize actual real people for the anti-fascist struggle and started talking to some peasants of Serbian descent in Croatia who were fleeing persecution about class struggle, the people just looked at them and said, I don't understand what you mean by that. I mean, you know, as far as I can see around, you know, I'm mostly surrounded by peasants. And other than that, I see some state bureaucrats and, you know, there's no class struggle. And I don't understand what this means. So Gilas, you know, was honest in the later stages of his life when he stopped being a communist. Writing his war memoirs says, look, so I had to address them in a way they could understand me. And, you know, what did I say to them? Well, you know, remember your ancestors. You know, just like Stalin said, remember, you know, Kutuzov and Suvorov and Donskoy and whatever else he mentioned in that famous speech. Remember how we fought in World War I. Remember how we you know, resisted against overwhelming force. Remember how we created our nations through blood and violence, and that's what's going to happen now. Heroes forward, okay? When they say, oh, Comrade Gilas, you know, now we understand what it's about. It's about the nation, you know? It's about our myths. It's about us. It's not about abstractions like class struggle. Now, what do I want to say with this? You know, we live in a world where, you know, a lot of people are trying to persuade us that we can freely choose our identities. And, you know, they're like menu options on your Apple phone. And, you know, I can become a man, a woman, an American, whatever. I mean, there are some constraints. I cannot become African American, for example. But, you know, generally speaking, we are living with this postmodern idea that everything is fluid. And I'm saying to you, it's not fluid. It's not fluid because myths and narratives, stories that we tell about ourselves, influence, they constrain the scope of the choices of actors and influence what we think. We grow up with them. So my grandfather was a Serbian army officer in 1941. He didn't join the resistance. He stayed at home, and he was visited by a Croatian army officer, his friend, who came from Zagreb on a train, who walked into his house in a fascist uniform. And my grandfather kicked him out. And of course, what did he say? Treason, okay? Just as our, you know, epic poem says, this is how we are defeated, treason. Okay, so then he ends up in a camp in Germany and survives. His story is not so important, but, you know, I grew up with that story. Does it mean that I dislike Croatians? No. Does it mean I don't have Croatian friends? No. As they say, some of my best friends are Croatian. Do I hate them? No. But I grew up with the story that, you know, there was a moment of betrayal, and I cannot just become Croatian. You know, that's the point. I was feeling Yugoslav, but I can't just turn around and say, you know, welcome, you know, to my house, Croatia. I'm now going to live in Zagreb and wave your flag. It just doesn't work that way. I am constrained by stories that someone told me. It's not that I'm deeply steeped in them, but I'm constrained by them. And this Serbian activist in Croatia in 1990 says, look, we were Yugoslavs until yesterday, and now what's happening? Well, some people call themselves Croat and other Muslim, and, you know, I think I'm Serbian, I guess. I mean, there's nothing else to do here, okay? And they're going to attack me, and I'm going to defend myself. Now, it really doesn't matter whether he's attacking or defending. You know, in the Croatians' perceptions, he was the one who is attacking and being aggressive. That's not the point. If people define situations as real, they're real in their consequences. And the consequences were that they redefined themselves as Serbs and no longer Yugoslavs, and that sprang from their historical experience, which confirmed their stories and myths and, you know, collective representations over time. So now we need to be Serbs, and that's that. So my first point, I guess, is that it's not as fluid as we like to think, because whether we recognize it consciously or not, we grow up with certain stories. Now, it's not maybe true of every nation in the same way, and there may be very different stories told, and maybe there are stories that allow for greater flexibility and lesser flexibility of choice, but we grew up with constraints. Second point is about status, honor, and nationalism. Nationalism is about, just like ethnicity, is about status group identification. The difference between status and class, as Max Weber told us, is the belief of status groups in the subjective superiority of their way of life or culture. And so it's not easy to assimilate into a status group because it's by definition exclusionary. So an Italian boy wants to marry a Jewish girl and the mother says, who's going to cook pizza and pasta for you? What are you going to eat? What about the Catholic Church? What about the family? You know, how are my children and grandchildren going to grow up? There's nothing evil about it. It's like natural, and vice versa, natural for status groups to be exclusionary, and especially when it comes to dilution of identity threats, okay? So I argue that nationalists, or I state rather than argue because I don't provide evidence, but that status honor is very important because it gives every member of the national community potentially a sense of superiority, no matter how low they are in the class or income hierarchy. That is why poor whites in the South were, greater racists than the landlords, and continue to trump social class. I put Trump here in capital letters on purpose. By the way, just 2 days ago, he said, I'm a nationalist. I'm not just a patriot. In America, there's a lot of hypocrisy about this. They say we're patriots, but they really are nationalists. So I can give it to Trump that at least he said the truth this one time. Nationalists demand respect more than anything else. Economic development is not a cure for nationalism because nationalism is mostly about status honor. That is, it can be associated with national greatness or a redefinition of national qualities. Okay, so Japan is no longer, imperialistic, but Japan first economically. It can become a part of nationalism, of course, and national self-re-identification. But it's not a cure, quote unquote, for it, nor is nationalism a disease, by the way. So economic development can be associated with greatness, can foster development, because economic breakthroughs depended on ideological breakthroughs. Okay, my third point is about, I don't have too much, well, I have time. I'm doing great. So I can actually now spend a little more time on my quotes and thoughts. So, ethnic entrepreneurs, this is quite often the argument. Political entrepreneurs make use of nationalist appeals to mobilize constituencies, and I'll have a slide about that later. But what do these appeals look like when you actually read them? Okay, what are they saying? Provided you think that rhetoric is not just rhetoric, that it actually sends a message to some constituencies. So Milosevic turns to nationalism, is the stereotypical story, and he does, but it's a little more complex because he embraces both Serbian nationalism and Yugoslav state nationalism. So it's a combination of things, and he draws on myth and on stories, and he doesn't say anything that is too different from what Milo Vanđila said to Serbian peasants in 1942. He says the same thing. Look, we have a heroic past. Are we going to give in now? That this federation is falling apart. We fought for Yugoslavia against the Ottomans, and what were the virtues we had against the Austrians and then against the Third Reich, and we ended up in these concentration camps. And if there was no heroism, there would have been no revolution, and revolution was good because it brought our people to a new level of economic and social existence. And of course, it's a kind of a communist Serbian Yugoslav narrative. Okay, so the partisans are good. The Serbian nationalists are actually bad in this story. They are not the resistors, and he never actually rehabilitated or spoke to monarchists at all. So the way he talks about it is very symbolic. And yes, it's instrumental at the same time. Of course, he's using this to say, vote for me, Serbs, because here's what I stand for, okay? And you understand this message because those are the stories you grew up with, okay? The stories of heroism and sacrifice and persecution and so on, and perseverance that leads to victory, okay? So let me just try to draw on this quote as an example of a broader point. So In rational choice theory, which is applied to nationalist mobilization quite often, sometimes quite successfully, political actors, of course, want to maximize power, but preferences are treated more or less as instrumental justifications for power. Nationalism can be a useful tool for mobilization or demobilization. Gannon wrote a very nice book about Serbia and Croatia in the 1980s and 90s and tried to show that both Milosevic and Tudjman used nationalism instrumentally in order to divert attention from economic reform and social issues and increase the salience of ethnicity in order to increase their power at the expense of other social and political identifications. That potentially could have represented a threat to their power. I have no problem with that, except for the assumption underneath that is very much in Gannon's book that this identity is not fixed. These Serbs, Croats, and Muslims in Bosnia, they were thinking mostly about economic reform, but then they were mobilized by ethnic entrepreneurs, and because they were mobilized by ethnic entrepreneurs, they became Serbian, Bosnian, and Croatian. No, they didn't. They were Serbian, Bosnian, and Croatian. I actually have a bit more experience in that because I served in the military for 11 months in Bosnia, and I heard a lot of stories. They always knew who they were, okay, when it came down to it. It's just that indeed was not politically the most salient thing at that time. It became over time, yes, partially because of ethnic entrepreneurs, but they didn't just invent identity, okay? It was there. For various reasons at different times for different groups, okay? So nationalism is powerful mobilizationally because it combines actually all the Weberian types of social action. It includes goal rationality, it includes status honor, which is basically value rationality. It involves emotional appeals, and it is traditional or, relies on custom, folklore, and tradition to mobilize people as well. Nationalist mobilization differs from other types of social mobilization, for example, trade union action, although not always, by the fact that it has an inbuilt symbolic dimension, okay? And so that's what makes it very difficult to separate, instrumental interests from culture, beliefs from interests. And it is virtually impossible sometimes to tell whether a political actor is just using nationalism instrumentally or truly believes in the story that he, in this case, is telling. If you ask me, I thought actually Milosevic was not just an opportunist. I think he believed in the communist narrative, which he reinterpreted in a Serbian kind of Yugoslav mythical narrative structure. I do believe he actually believed in something, even though he was an extremely cynical technician of politics. In a shallow sense, Machiavellian. So 5 minutes, I'm great. I'm almost there. So I talked about three things: myths, narratives. I talked about status honor. I talked about very briefly and inadequately in all cases about the instrumental manipulation of nationalism. I just wanted to say one more thing about this instrumental manipulation. Constraints on instrumental manipulation are also always there. You have to manipulate something where there's a real fertile soil, počva, as the Russians say, for it. Milosevic could not provoke a war with Macedonia. Macedonia was a part of the Serbian state, after the Second Balkan War and in the interwar Yugoslavia. Nobody ever had a dream of, sending an army to Macedonia and conquering them. We had no grievances against Macedonians, very few. They could have been exploited, and they against us more, quote unquote, because there was also a Bulgarian narrative and Serbs were the oppressors and so on of the Macedonian nation. But, there was never a war. There was never even a talk about something with Macedonia. But, in Bosnia and Croatia, where there was a history of, violence, that's a different story. So you manipulate something where there's a real grievance. You cannot just be ethnically entrepreneurial on the basis of nothing. Ressentiment. Well, of course, that's very hard to measure, but we all know that it exists. and it persists. And I actually like the original, well, after Nietzsche, original interpretation of it by Shaler, because it speaks to my case and also to the Russian case I'll show in a moment. So what Shaler says is, you know, these feelings of revenge, malice, envy, the desire to spite, and so on, is actually a consequence of weakness. So the most frequent cause of ressentiment is in the discrepancy between political, constitutional, or the traditional status of a group and its actual power. And then he talks about how in the age of equality, the fact that everyone has formal citizenship status, but is unequal in other respects, you know, builds ressentiment and envy and malice into the very structure of society, because those who are left out in the game of competitive economics or markets, or who don't succeed, you know, well, you know, often engage in ressentiment in various ways. And of course, the same psychology, if you want, or social psychology applies to nations, whether internationally or domestically, in the case of Serbia in the 1980s. So, you know, it used to be a stereotype, also widespread. The Serbs dominated Yugoslavia. Everyone was resentful because they dominated. They were dominated in the interwar period. They were hegemonists. In the communist period, they were overrepresented. But that's not how it looked to Serbs in the 1980s. They basically looked around and they said everyone has a republic and we have 2 autonomous provinces, and in one of them Kosovo Serbs are being kicked out and nobody's doing anything about it. And look at our leadership, it's weak, and constitution is weak. It doesn't protect our people from persecution. And you know, this lasted for 6 or 7 years before, you know, the fellow on the previous picture, the ugly apparatchik, you know, showed up and said, you know, we will fix this, comrades, in communist language. So Serbian nationalism was a product of weakness rather than strength. Putin's speech on Crimea, and I'm going to end here. I'm in time, right? Great. Right. I'm amazed at myself. Okay, so that's because I didn't read all those quotes. I hope you did have a chance to read them. So Putin's speech on Crimea, to me, exemplifies all 4 points, in fact. So in the first case, he talks about, of course, he uses it instrumentally, but again, he probably believes in some of that as well. I mean, I'm sure he does. Now, I'm not George W. Bush. I didn't look into his soul, but I assume that he does believe in something like that, at least the state myth. So Crimea is highly symbolic. Well, for any number of reasons. It's where Christianity took place, it was Prince Vladimir, and it's the battles, and it's the Crimean War, and it's Sevastopol, and it's Sevastopol again in World War II, and each of those places is dear to our hearts, symbolizing Russian military glory and outstanding valor. So, of course, here's a narrative of heroism, very much similar to the Serbian one, because the historical experience is similar in this respect, at least. Status honor. Of course it's present because he talks throughout about the dignity and pride and prestige of the Russian nation based on these historical accomplishments, which they want to take away from us by force while pretending that it's peaceful. Okay? So that's there. Of course there's the instrumental manipulation of nationalism, which is basically, you know, we didn't lose Crimea in 1991 because we wanted to end communist rule, or we didn't want to have a nuclear war with Ukraine, or because our people then didn't think that it was important. No, we lost it because we were weak. Well, you know, that's a kind of a useful lie. So it's clearly instrumental. And then there's ressentiment. So what is ressentiment? It's not when you say some concrete policy is wrong, because, look, the West is so hypocritical. You know, they recognize Kosovo, they didn't, without a referendum, they didn't recognize Crimea with a referendum. Double standards, dvojný standard. Sure, there is, yes, there is. That's not necessarily ressentiment, but it starts verging on ressentiment when you say, well, no, that's just a manifestation of something bigger. So their ideology of human rights is just a cover-up for deeper things. That's a lie. It's an ideological self-justification for realpolitik pretensions. I'm done, almost. Then it becomes ressentiment when, you know, you transpose it and make it into a centuries-long policy of ušemljenje Rusiji, you know, of trying to put Russia down and, not allow it to assume its rightful place among the great powers, because it's a centuries-long policy of containment, not the Cold War, not a specific policy of the Clinton, but they've been doing this since Peter the Great. And also what is telling in ressentiment is, of course, what is a good indicator of it is the intensity of emotions with which it is expressed. And so I'm ending with this slide where he says, look, there's an infamous policy that goes back from the 18th to the 19th centuries. They're constantly trying to sweep us into a corner because we have an independent position. They cannot tolerate. They're hypocritical. They've always been like this. They are the bear. We are not the Medved. They're the Medved. They're always beating down on us. Well, they miscalculated this time. We will spite them. We will show them who is the boss here, okay? You cannot just step all over us like that, and so on. And he justifies it very, very cleverly. But the intensity of the emotion shows towards in this speech. And of course, we can now endlessly argue whether it's instrumental or status honor or genuine belief. It's probably some combination of all of the above. So nationalism is complex, and there's no easy cure for it. And on that beautiful note, I'll make my last point. Where does it leave us? With the next speaker.